continuing our study of the book of 1 Kings. We're going to pick up where we left off last time in 1 Kings chapter 8, down around verse 54. And to catch up, you see where we are on our timeline up there. You see that somewhat exaggerated representation of Solomon's temple right here. You see where we are time-wise. That shows a rather elaborate temple. That's probably a better depiction of it right there on the very top row towards the center in that photograph. There's a model in Jerusalem. But here's where we are time-wise. We're roughly, according to our timeline, about 1000 BC, a little bit less than 1000 BC, about 3100 years after creation. But where we are now, it's interesting time-wise.
Are we going to talk about this?
No, not really. Talk about the fact that it was built, and where we are historically, Solomon is now king, of course. Solomon has completed the construction of the temple. Took him 7 years. He's completed the construction of his own house, his palace. The temple, last time we had the dedication of the temple, there was a sacrifice of so many sheep and oxen that they couldn't be counted or numbered. And then we have that very interesting account in verse 11. After the sacrifice, it says that, and it came about when the priest came from the holy place that the cloud filled the house of the Lord. In other words, the temple was filled with a cloud, which was God's presence. And it says, so that the priest could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. And so we have this tremendous event in the life of the nation of Israel. And so after that we have Solomon's prayer of dedication, which we read in some detail last time. And now in verse 54, we have what's called Solomon's benediction. It's a statement that he pronounces after he has his prayer of dedication. And it represents a very significant time in Israel's history. And after we read it, I want you to tell me what you think is significant about it. And we're going to kind of trace the history of Israel before that and after that to an extent. So 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 54. Jackie, would you start reading for me?
When Solomon had finished all these prayers and supplications to the Lord, he rose from before the altar of the Lord, where he had been kneeling, and his hands spread out toward heaven.
Do you need a Bible? Do we have an extra Bible around here?
They flooded. Unless there's one on that back.
On that box, but
I know you got most of it memorized, but sometimes it's helpful.
Fill in the gaps.
Fill in.
We had to throw a lot of them out.
yeah.
Yep, 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 55. Got it?
Got it.
Okay, read on.
He stood and blessed the whole assembly of Israel, and a loud voice sang, "Praise be to the Lord, who has given rest to his people Israel, just as he had promised. Not one word has failed all the good promises he gave through his servant Moses."
Pause right there just a second. That verse 56 is very significant because of what Solomon says about what's going on now in the life of Israel. And we read some of it before, we're going to read some of it afterwards, but if you underline that word rest, I think that's very significant, and that's almost a pivotal point, if you will, in the life of Israel. And he says, let me read that again. Solomon says, "Blessed to the Lord who has given rest to his people Israel according to all that he promised. Not one word has failed of all his good promise, which he promised through Moses his servant." What is so significant about that?
He was following God's word.
Yep. But he says, what he's acknowledging is what? That Israel is now at what?
At rest.
It is at a state of rest. All right, what's significant about that?
They're at peace.
No war.
They're at peace, no war. But remember, rest was a very significant part of the Mosaic covenant. In fact, what is said to be the sign or the token or the symbol of the Mosaic covenant?
Rest.
The Sabbath rest, that's exactly right. Going back, look at you know, if we look at the three covenants, we could probably spend a whole lesson talking about this, and we might sometime. Who knows? Maybe today, for all I know. I don't know where we're going. But the Abrahamic covenant, what was the sign or the token of the Abrahamic covenant? Circumcision. That's exactly right. Scripture tells us so in Genesis, I think it's chapter 17. And then the Mosaic covenant comes about. We all know the circumstance there. God gives the law. They have a solemn ceremony. Moses reads the law to the people, and the people respond and say, all that the Lord has spoken and all the Lord has commanded, we will do. And so they made a covenant. Moses holds up the blood. He says, behold the blood of the covenant. So they enter into the covenant. And later on, God says that I have given you the Sabbath rest, and the Sabbath rest shall be the sign of this covenant, or the token of this covenant. And then fast forward to the time of Christ, the new covenant, the New Testament. What is the sign of the New Testament?
The Holy Spirit.
The Holy Spirit, that's certainly a part of it. But the symbol, I was reading those words this morning. I was studying the covenants, and there's a couple of interesting things about that. We talk about, if I have enough space on the board, I'll write it down. Maybe I'll write it down right now, because we're there. The Abrahamic covenant. I've got a pen here. Again, the sign was circumcision. Tell me if I spelled that wrong. Circumcision. That's pretty close. The Mosaic covenant, the sign was what?
Sabbath rest.
The Sabbath rest. I'm going to say sign. I looked up the word that was used for sign in the Old Testament, where it says the sign of the Abrahamic covenant was circumcision. The sign of the Mosaic covenant was the Sabbath rest. And what that word means, it could be, sometimes it's translated as token, which I think is an interesting word. Sometimes it's translated as a thing of remembrance. So the idea is that a certain thing is given so that people would think about it and they'd remember the covenant and they'd remember the significant aspects of the covenant. And so then we say what we call the new covenant, the sign, the token, or the remembrance of the new covenant. Think about what Jesus says, this do in remembrance of me, or this do as a token, this do as a sign, which was what?
Lord's Supper.
Lord's Supper, but specifically the bread
And the wine. And the cup.
and the cup. Okay? Call it wine, juice, we know it's fruit of the vine, whether it's fermented or not, doesn't really matter. But it's interesting what those things represent and what they're intended to remind us of. And it's interesting too, I looked up the word covenant as it's used in the Old Testament. We talked about this many times. We know what a covenant is. A covenant can really represent several different things. In its most basic sense, a covenant is a contract. A bargain for exchange between people. A covenant, as that word is used, can also be in the nature of a treaty between a sovereign and its subjects. Okay? A covenant can also be, just generically speaking, in the nature of a last will and testament. Okay? So it can be any one of those three things. Okay? The Abrahamic covenant was, out of those, what is that more in the nature of, would you say?
That's a physical sign.
Well, it's a physical sign, but the covenant itself is really more in the nature of, in my mind, it's more like a peace treaty. It's more of a unilateral thing, because what did God say? All you have to do is just believe me and trust me, and what you'll be blessed. That's what he told to Abraham.
But blood was shed.
There was shedding blood. The Mosaic covenant was really almost in the nature of a contract. God says, I'm going to be your God, I'm going to be your provider. But here are these things that you have to do. 10 commandments plus some. So you do these things, and then I do these things. So it's almost a bargain for exchange. God laid down the terms, but everybody had to agree to it. And that's why we have that account in Exodus where Moses reads the law to the people. Remember, they had the solemn ceremony. He reads the law. They listen to it, they hear it, and then they recite, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do, and we will be obedient. So there was a two-sided thing. What did you start to say, brother?
Well, that's what we should be in. Everyone should be wanting to come together and worship. That sounds like me, the Sabbath rest.
Right, that's right.
And in their hearts right now, because of the temple being built and being brand new,
Yep,
they're all in one heart.
yep,
We
yep,
pulled together to worship.
yep. Rest was
Worship.
a very important part of that. But let me before we come back to that, let me finish this thought out. As I was looking in the New Testament, the word that's used for covenant is sometimes translated as covenant, sometimes it's New Testament, and particularly is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 24 and 25, and also the Lord's Supper account, Matthew 26, 28. The word that Jesus uses there is really better translated when he says, behold the blood. This is the blood of the New Testament or the New Covenant. The word that he uses there for covenant, that's sometimes translated as covenant, is really better translated as testament, because the word that he uses there, it's a diatheke, D-I-A-T-H-E-K-E in the Greek. And that was always used to refer to one's disposition of property in prospect of one's own death. So, like the nature of a last will and testament, more than a contract. So Jesus, he uses a common word, covenant, but he uses a specific definition or a specific connotation of it, as you will, as less of a contract, less of a treaty, and more in the nature of a last will and testament. But anyway, let's talk about those things. The Abrahamic covenant, the sign was circumcision. Again, what was circumcision intended to be and represent? Remember where that comes about?
No confidence in the flesh.
Exactly. Paul said, we are the true circumcision who worship in the Spirit of God and glory in Christ Jesus and put no confidence in the flesh. Because remember, circumcision was initiated in Genesis chapter 17. Because you remember what happened in Genesis chapter 15, God makes a covenant with Abraham, right? And he says, basically, Abraham, all you have to do is to believe what I'm telling you. And what does God tell him that he wants him to believe?
That he's going to give him a son.
I'm going to give you a son, and you're going to be the father of a great nation. Your offspring are going to be so numerous that you're not going to be able to count them. They're going to be like the stars of the sky or like the sand of the seashore. But Abraham, all you have to do is just believe me. And how well did Abraham do to just believe me? Not too well, because in chapter 16...
Like the rest of us would do.
Wait, don't say that. Some of us might.
Some of us might.
Not the rest of us might be.
Okay.
But what happened? They're waiting around. He's kind of checking his watch. Sarah, how you doing? Well, still waiting. Gets to be years and years. And what do? Rather than trusting in God, they devise a plan. Well, let's just help God along. Okay, and that's where Hagar and Ishmael come along. And that's chapter 16 of Genesis. And then chapter 17 is where circumcision comes in. And circumcision, never forget, was very much a rebuke, I believe, of what Abraham and Sarah did. Okay? You think about, of all the signs that God could initiate, why circumcision? Well, it was a rebuke of what they did, because what did they do? They put confidence in their flesh. And the whole idea of the cutting of the flesh, the mortification of the flesh, as is demonstrated in circumcision, was to mortify, was to kill the flesh, and to show them you did exactly the opposite of what I told you to do. I told you not to put confidence in the flesh. I told you to just trust me, believe me, but you did the opposite. So therefore, the sign of circumcision was initiated, again, as a rebuke, which is to say, do not put any confidence in the flesh, because what we've seen the whole history of mankind is they have a tendency to what? Trust in themselves, trust in their own ability. So then the Mosaic covenant comes along, and why is it necessary to have the Mosaic covenant if the Abrahamic covenant was always intended to be an eternal or an everlasting covenant? What was the necessity of the Mosaic covenant?
They broke that covenant.
They absolutely broke the Abrahamic covenant, didn't they? Mm-hmm. So God says, we're going to try something else. And I believe, I don't think it was so much a new or different covenant as it was an addition of terms to it. Okay, so the idea was, under the Abrahamic covenant, all you have to do, God says, all you have to do is just believe me, just trust me, just believe that what I'm saying is true and is going to come about and everything will be fine. And they proved that they couldn't do that, right?
No, they couldn't.
So what did they need? They needed some little blanks that they could check off the boxes. And so God says, all right, we're going to see how, since you can't do that, let's try something else. I'm going to give you a checklist of 10 items. If you just do these 10 items, then you're in good shape. So in addition to giving them the 10 items, he says also, you know, sort of as a coverall, he says, I'm also going to give you the Sabbath rest. And the idea of the Sabbath rest was to what?
To trust in God.
That's right. That's right. To just, you know, there comes a time, he says, work 6 days. In fact, the commandment says, thou shalt work 6 days. 6 days working, doing what? Trying to complete all these. But on the seventh day, just stop. Just stop trying to perform. Stop trying to fulfill these requirements and just rest in me. Just trust in me. And everything will be okay. And he said that's going to be the sign of the Mosaic covenant, is the Sabbath rest, because that's going to be the most important aspect of it, to rest in me and trust in me. Really sort of in the nature of the Abrahamic covenant, right? And then the new covenant, I know we're getting ahead of ourselves here, but I think it's very intriguing when you look at how Christ instituted this new covenant. And you think about the new covenant, is it something totally new and different from what was said to be the eternal covenant or the everlasting covenant?
No.
And why does Jesus refer to it as a testament, if you will, a testamentary disposition of something, like something that Jesus is giving to people? And so what does he say? He says, I want you to remember this. The sign, the remembrance, he says, this do in remembrance of me. What? Take the bread and take the cup, which is to remind us of something. To remind us of a very important aspect of the covenant that had been built up to that point in time. Because remember, we had, under the Mosaic covenant, we had, I wish I had it in the road. We had law, right? And then Moses comes along in Deuteronomy, specifically chapter 28, and he says, okay, the law is very simple. He says, obey, and you get what?
Blessings.
Blessings. And he says over here, disobey, and you get what?
Curses.
Curses. He says that is the Mosaic covenant in a nutshell. God gives you the law, you obey it, you're going to get these blessings, and the blessings are wonderful. If you disobey it, you're going to get the curses, and it's terrible. So then, after this, why is it necessary? Why does Jesus come along and say, now, here is my last will and testament, and in my last will and testament, I'm leaving you two things. Number one, I'm leaving you bread, and number two, I'm leaving you the cup. How do those relate to the Mosaic covenant? In a very important way, because what did the bread represent?
Jesus' body.
His body, but even more important than that, it represented his earthly life, in which he did what? Before
a living sacrifice, because there was no sin in him.
Right, well, right, because he said, I came to fulfill
The covenant.
To fulfill the requirements of the law. That's exactly right.
Right.
And one of the things that we're told about that, Jesus himself said when in the Sermon on the Mount, he said, I did not come to do away with the law or the prophets, rather I came to fulfill. And later on, Paul tells us in Romans chapter 8, he says, Jesus came to fulfill the requirements of the law for us. So that's what his bread represented. He came to fulfill the requirements of the law. And so when he gives us the bread, what is he saying? I'm giving you the fulfillment of the requirements of the law. I'm giving you. You don't have to perform anymore, because I have performed for you, which means that when I give you this, I'm giving you all the blessings. And the same way over here, the cup represented what?
His blood.
That's right, his death, his sacrifice. And so the scripture tells us that without the shedding of blood, there's no remission of sins. So he shed his blood for the remission of our sins. And scripture also says that he became the curse so that we would not receive the curse of the broken law which we deserve. So when Jesus gives us in his last testament the cup, what's he doing? He's saying that I gave you the cup to take away the curses. I gave you the bread to give you the blessings. And that's really sort of the fulfillment, the completion of the cycle, if you will, of what the eternal, the everlasting covenant was from the very beginning to the very end. And in that context, it really does make sense that Jesus would use the word testament or last will and testament rather than a covenant, because it really is very much what he is giving to us in twofold measure and how it relates to the entirety of the covenant system. Now, I got off track there. Where were we?
Verse 57.
Oh, we're in verse 56. Let's not get past that yet because that's what caused us to pause and reflect. Blessed be the Lord who has given rest. That takes us back to the Mosaic covenant, right? That God says, I'm giving you this time, this thing called the Sabbath rest, in which you are not to work, you're not to do anything except to rest in me. And remember how it was, even Jesus says, come unto me, all ye who labor and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. A very valuable commodity in God's economy. And so it's very significant here that Solomon says, at this time in the history of the nation of Israel, he says what? He says, God has given us rest. We are finally at rest after all of these years that they've been looking for rest, because they really haven't had too much, have they? Read on there. We're gonna.
Wait, I got a question.
Go ahead.
So after the new covenant,
Uh-huh.
every day is the Sabbath rest. We are all, every day we're to rest.
Absolutely.
Not just on
Absolutely.
Sunday.
Yep.
In him.
Yep.
We do still do work.
That's exactly right.
Okay, what'd you say?
It all goes back to Adam and Eve trying to get the rest that they had before they made the mistake.
Yep. They were searching for it. When they got kicked out of the garden, yep, they were
They
constantly
had
looking
rest
for rest.
before that and a relationship with God. So,
Exactly. That's
so
right.
each time, when you see all the different covenants, I always go back to Adam and Eve. Look like the covenant with them was leave this alone. And
Yep.
I'll have the relationship with
Pretty
you.
simple set of rules back then, huh? Just one rule. Yeah. Okay, read on.
Starting in 57.
57, yeah.
May the Lord our God be with us as he was with our fathers. May he never leave us or forsake us. May he turn our hearts to him to walk in all his ways and to keep his commands, decrees, and regulations he gave our fathers. And may these words of mine, which I have prayed before the Lord, be near the Lord our God, and day and night, that he may uphold the cause of his servant and the cause of his people, Israel, according to each day's needs, so that in all the peoples of the earth may know, that the Lord is God, and there is no other. But our hearts must be fully committed to the Lord our God, to live by his decrees and obey his commands, as at this time.
So those last two verses that Jackie just read are very significant too. So Solomon pronounces here, after the temple has been constructed, it's been dedicated, the presence of God has filled the temple. Solomon says, now, here we are at rest. God has given us rest. He has fulfilled every promise that he's made to us. And then he explains in verse 60 the purpose of that. Why has God brought us here? Why has he given us these things? Why has he manifested his presence? He says, so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the Lord is God and there is no one else. And then he gives the word of instruction. Let your heart therefore be wholly devoted to the Lord our God, to walk in his statutes and to keep his commandments as at this day. Now that'd be kind of a great point to end the Old Testament, wouldn't it? Mm-hmm. Because I'll submit to you that what we read in the next couple of chapters, it all relates to this circumstance. But one of the things that ties into what Jackie just read is if you flip over to chapter 10, verse 23, after pronouncing all that Solomon did and all that he had and all that he acquired, it says in verse 23, so King Solomon became greater than all of the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom. So, we're going to continue reading, but what does this represent in the life of Israel? What does this period represent, in your opinion?
Blessings.
Blessings. To me, as I was kind of working my way through, I was kind of thinking along the timeline. This really does represent one of the highest points in the nation of Israel that has been recorded in the scriptures so far. I made myself a little timeline as I was starting, and I wanted to elicit your help in putting this together. Everybody got this memorized? It's going to be on the final exam too. Okay.
We're good.
Got it? Some of this stuff may not be erasable, so. Uh-oh.
You like that one? You better
I
get
didn't
rid
like
of
that
it.
one.
Let's get rid of that one. That's a Sharpie.
Uh-oh. No, that's not the one I was writing with, is
No,
it?
that says dry erase.
I think, what about that one right there? There we go.
That's dry erase, isn't it? It says washable, it doesn't say erasable.
It's washing up.
Should we hide it?
Yes,
I'm taking those.
otherwise it's going to over.
Okay,
Making it dry for you now.
Yes.
good. You're better than I am.
You ever had to wash a blackboard because you were being bad?
I take the fifth on that.
Previous experience.
And I dusted many an eraser too. You talk to kids these days about, we used to have, stay in it, go out at recess and dust those erasers and say, what in the world are you talking about? What is that? Right.
So this was the best time in Israel's history then, and why Solomon was supposed to be so smart and so wise, he was miserable.
Well, he was, but that comes later. What I want us to do, and I said I put the high and low points of Israel's history. I put Israel in quotes because, if we start back with Adam, that's not really Israel. Israel comes along obviously after Israel comes along. But you know what I'm talking about. I'm really talking about the line of God's people. As we were talking this morning, we were looking over this chart, and one of the interesting things you're going to see on this chart is not only do you have the family timeline, but starting with Adam, this line right here, this is the line of Christ. This is the lineage of Christ. It starts with Adam, of course, then goes through Seth, and Enos, and Canaan, and all these guys with hard to pronounce names, Methuselah, Noah, of course, and then Shem, and then just follows all the way along. So very interesting. And of course, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Israel right here. So, but this is the line we're talking about, the line of God's people, which I'll loosely refer to as Israel. Okay, what I want to do is I want to pick some events, and I'm going to have Jennifer get up on the chart and tell us roughly when they occurred. You started this. Jennifer's the one who
Yes.
got this chart for us, so we can all thank her and Jeff for doing that.
Thank you, Jim. Did you open it before you came? No idea.
Okay, we have Adam and Eden. So we're going to put the event. Jennifer's going to give us roughly the time, and then we're going to draw a chart and see if we're high or low from there, which way we're headed. Because I think that's going to be interesting. And then I'm going to put sin and cast out of the garden. Okay. And the next event is going to be the flood. Next event is going to be Abraham in the promised land. I picked Abraham's arrival in the promised land as I think is a pretty significant in the event in life of Israel. Okay, and then Egypt. And then back to the promised land. And then, I'm going to say the temple dedication. And then, I'm going to say the temple destruction, yeah. Which was the same time as what? What followed the temple destruction? Babylonian captivity, right?
Captivity, yeah.
Okay. This is neutral. Everything above it is plus, everything below it is a minus. Talk about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Where do you put that?
Plus,
That was
that was God's land.
very high.
That's pretty high. I think that data point goes about right there.
Yep.
Sin cast out.
All the way to the bottom.
Oh my goodness. That's pretty close to the bottom. Then what about what's going on at the time of the flood? Is that good or is that
That
bad?
was bad.
Man,
That's got to be pretty close to the bottom too. We're kind of bouncing along
although that was supposed to be a cleansing of the earth.
the bottom.
What
Yeah.
led to it?
Yeah.
Was bad.
Yes, sin led
Okay.
to it.
Now, after the flood, we've got a long history. All right, Jennifer, what are the dates for us? All right, when was
In the beginning.
in the beginning? When was Adam created? What year was that?
This is a trick question.
No, it's
Yeah.
it's 4,004.
Okay, we're going to call it 4000 BC. We're going to round off. All right, and how long after that did they sin and get cast out? How many years did they walk with God? We don't know. That was a trick question. We're gonna give them 100 years. I don't know. We're gonna say,
There's 100 right here. Does that mean something?
yeah, it means something. I don't know what it means.
Okay.
So we're gonna say 3,900 plus or minus. All right, that's when they cast out. All right, here's one deer's answer. When did the flood take place?
Right here, I see this nice picture of
The
the
rainbow.
rainbow. So I'm thinking
Yeah.
right here.
Okay, which is what?
2348.
Okay, well, that's precise. Okay.
What month?
Hey,
Is that a Wednesday?
Jennifer, you know why I asked you to get up there and read it? Because we can't see it.
That's a lot
Okay.
of fine print on it.
You say any number.
all right, when does Abraham arrive in the promised land?
Good.
Abraham's name is right here.
Okay,
So find the,
2091.
they're the pyramids, so it's further
good
down
idea.
to the
Down here?
right.
because it
Yeah,
said,
right.
how old was Abraham when he arrives in the promised land? 75 years old. Okay, but that's what I had. I had about 2091, so I'm gonna call that 2100 BC plus or minus. Okay.
Where is that on there?
Yeah, where is that? I see 23. And then
That should be right in here.
So how come the pyramids are to the right of that?
the call of the
Yeah,
Egyptians.
it's
the
right in
offering of
here.
Isaac.
It would have been when he's about 75 years old, so just count him over, that's it.
Okay.
Right.
But that was while
So,
they were.
somewhere right
Depends
around
on who
here.
you're talking to. Some people say
It's
days.
got a lot right here.
It's along there somewhere. Okay, so that's about where it
But
is.
that's not.
All right. Then, all right, what were the years of their time in Egypt?
400 years?
They were there for 430 years, that's right.
1885, Joseph rules Egypt.
Yep.
That's,
This is roughly, it's roughly 1876 to 1446 BC, 430 years. Okay. And then, after that, they arrived in the promised land. That's a very significant point. What year was that roughly? If this is,
1400?
Yeah, well, 1406, that's right.
Well, it's 40 years.
Okay.
Longer.
And then, all right, now we're about where we are right now, the temple dedication, which is about what? What year was the temple construction started?
Where is the picture of it on there?
It's right here.
It's completed 959.
Yeah, there's
That's right, 959, so we're gonna say roughly 959.
It was.
It was
These-
started in 966.
That's exactly right, 966 took 7 years, so it was complete about 959. And then, when was the temple destroyed?
In 5, let me find it. 586?
Yep, exactly. And that would have been the third wave of the Babylonians coming to town, so to speak. They started in 605 BC, and they hauled off Daniel, they came back in 597, hauled off Ezekiel, and finally they came back in 586. They destroyed the temple. So the temple stood for about, if my math is correct, for about 480 years, plus or minus. Pretty good long time.
That's pretty interesting because it was built 480 years after they came out of Egypt.
Yeah, actually, it's 380. It was built 480 years after it came out of Egypt, and then it stood for 380 years. If my math is wrong, 966 to 586 is 380. Yeah,
380.
but
Okay.
still, a pretty good long time. 380 years, almost 400 years. Okay, so let's plot where we are. We've gone, boy, way down. We bounced along the bottom. Then Abraham comes into the promised land. I'd say that's a positive event. Maybe not the highest, but that's definitely a positive event right there. Then Egypt and the Egyptian captivity. Where would you put that when they're in slavery in Egypt?
When they were in slavery at the bottom, but
But
when
in
they
the
first
beginning-
went in there, I would put it just about neutral.
About neutral, yeah.
Is that
So-
safe there?
So on the way here,
Did it say?
Yeah.
and then boom, then down. Why did God put the children of Israel in slavery in Egypt for 400 years?
To protect them.
To protect them. But it was also punishment of a sort.
Yeah, but to build
For
up
what?
that, to build up the people,
Obeying
population.
What's that?
Not obeying his word.
Yep, not obeying his word, but they also did something very evil. Okay? Remember, how did the children of Israel wind up in Egypt? What took them there?
Food. They
Their
needed-
sin against Joseph.
That's right.
The brothers
That's right.
sin
The-
against
The
Joseph.
brothers, they had it in their hearts to kill their own brother, okay? Out of magnanimity, they didn't kill him, they just threw him in a pit with the hope and belief that he'd be captured by some slavers and taken off who knows where, and that's exactly what happened. that you all know the story. But I think it's because of what Joseph's brothers did to him. They hated him. They had a desire in their heart to kill him. Very much like the nation of Israel, the leaders of Israel had the desire to kill Jesus himself in his day. I think that's the same evil thought that they had, and I think that's what brought them into Egypt. But as Joseph himself said, what you brothers intended for evil, God had a plan for good. He intended for good. And so God brought them together. There are only about 70 of them, right? When Jacob and the family came to Egypt, and by the time they left, how many were there?
Millions.
Millions.
Probably, yeah. There was over 600,000 men, so you add the women and the children to it, it's probably a couple of million people by that time. So God grew them into
But
quite a-
also, God sent them to Egypt because the time for the punishment of the Canaanites had not yet come.
Yeah,
It's-
that's a very
like in
interesting phrase.
Scripture.
Yeah, yeah.
Their sin was not complete and it had not, the time had not come.
Yeah, manifestation of God's grace. He was giving them time, but they never did come around. Okay, so they're in Egypt, all right. From Egypt, they spend 40 years in the wilderness, right? Now, how would you rank that? I'd call that suboptimal.
Yeah.
Because they were supposed to go right here.
Not the worst. They're being led by God, so I think it's, to get
Yes, they're
from
being taken care of.
that's right. from being a slave to being out in the wilderness, it was a step up, but again,
They weren't-
suboptimal condition.
They weren't high.
You'd have to go 2 times there because they went back down because, they all were destroyed before they cut
Yeah, a lot of zigging and zagging in there. But again, God had a plan. I believe God wanted them to be in the wilderness for about 2 years, okay? And during that 2-year period of time, what was the principal lesson that God wanted the children of Israel to learn?
Trust.
Sabbath rest.
Rely on God. Rely on God.
Yeah, rely. The word I would use is dependence. God wanted all the children of Israel to learn dependence upon Him, which, going back to our chart, don't put any confidence in your flesh, in your own ability. So God, when they got thirsty, God provided water. When they got hungry, God provided food. And through that, God was wanting to teach them to depend totally on Him, because that was going to be preparation for entering into the promised land, and really a life with Him, to learn to depend on Him. Okay, so then after they spend an extra 38 years in the wilderness, total of 40, they come to the promised land. Where do you put that?
High.
About the same as Abraham going into the promised land.
Yeah, I think that's those two are about on par. You know, going into the promised land the first time, all right, great thing. They left because of their sin. Now they're back. And then you get to the point of the temple dedication.
Yeah, that would be quite high.
And that is almost as high, I think, as being in the Garden of Eden. Okay? Because what is the manifestation here? God Himself has brought His presence. God had promised him long ago. He said, I'm going to take you to a land, I'm going to give you a land. He made covenants with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. I'm going to give you the land. He said, I'm going to establish my presence in Jerusalem, in a temple. Okay? David wanted to build a temple. God says, no, Solomon's going to build a temple. The temple is built, it's dedicated, and God comes there to visit him. That's a pretty high point. In fact, I'll submit to you, and I want you to think about it. Let's go to the next step, the temple destruction, Babylonian captivity. Where do you put that?
Pretty close to the bottom.
Pretty close to the bottom. So, again, they go up, and then all the way back down. Now, of course, we know we have the return from captivity, which occurred under Cyrus the Great.
You spelled that wrong.
All right, return, okay, and that's when they built the second temple, Zerubbabel's temple, which I think was completed about 516 BC. The temple, and I think they actually returned about 535. They started building the temple about 520, but they finished at about 516 BC. So this is, how would you rank this?
Just a little above neutral.
A little neutral, I'll agree with that, okay? So it's certainly a step up. It's better than being in captivity, but nowhere close to this.
Nowhere close to that, and nowhere, I don't think it's even as close as them coming back into the promised land myself, but.
Right. It's probably about on par with being there, maybe a little bit below. I think I agree with that, okay? So they're back in the promised land, but
Things are so bad for them that it's,
yeah. After that, they never had a king on the line
No.
until Jesus came along, right? Everybody returned, they were rulers, but they're always subservient to whoever
Right.
the greatest country in the world was, whether it's Persia or Greece or Rome or whoever it was.
So
But
the temple actually was destroyed again, dedicated and then destroyed.
yeah, the temple was dedicated. This is Solomon's temple. It was destroyed in 586
It was
BC.
torn.
The Babylonians totally tore it down.
They didn't just plunder it, they tore it.
They burned it with fire and they tore it down. Because you remember, when they came back from captivity, the old ones who had been there before, when they started laying out, remember they took out their stakes and they started staking out, they drew their string around it. The old people, they cried, remember, because they said it's not nearly as large as it was before, and it's not going to be of the same grandeur. So it was smaller, but yeah, they rebuilt it. It was the second temple, which was then enlarged around Jesus' time by Herod, but it's the same second temple.
When did they build the wall? After what?
Solomon started building the wall. There's reference in here to Solomon building the wall,
You remember when Nehemiah went back, when was that?
that was 444 BC.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was around the same time that, interestingly, that the Parthenon in Athens was built. Around the same time Nehemiah was building the wall, they were building the
That
Parthenon.
builds Jerusalem wall.
In Greece.
Yeah, because the Parthenon was built in 448,
Yeah.
under this timeline.
Because you remember what Solomon said is that he said, I'm going to build a wall, but the Canaanites are going to pay for it. Never mind.
I was thinking the same thing. I love to ship a penny.
All right, politics aside. Judging from this, can you think about, and where we are today in our lesson is at the point of the temple dedication, Solomon being declared the greatest king in the world at the time, the wealthiest king. Solomon has declared, God has given us rest. He has fulfilled every promise he has made to us. We have peace on all sides, right? None of our enemies are audacious enough to try to attack us. Why? Because they know that God is with us, as evidenced by our prosperity, by our wealth, by our dedication to him, by God's manifestation in the temple. Okay. Can you think of any time in Israel's history after this when they're close to that point? I don't think there is one.
Well, I think
Now,
that's-
spiritually, when Christ is resurrected, I mean, that's obviously a high point. But in terms of Israel's history, I'll submit to you, that's the high point. Very interesting, huh? So everything is really downhill from here. Kind of a sad story.
And Solomon had gone out to all these countries to get the supplies to build the temple, so he was paying.
Yeah.
They've been paid good money for the cypress and everything else they needed.
Yeah.
So why would you want to go to war?
That's right. That's
Destroy
right.
a good thing.
Had a
Money
good,
coming
had a
in.
good economy going, didn't they?
Yeah, they really had
No,
it
no, no,
going.
no, no, no. Y'all are saying it didn't depend on them.
No.
It was on God.
It was God
That's
was
right.
leading,
Yes.
God was leading Solomon to
That's
do
right.
these things.
And the important thing, again, this is really before Solomon's complete turn. We've gotten some clues as we've gone along that Solomon wasn't totally dedicated to God, that he kind of strayed, but he hasn't really fallen off the wagon just yet. Because where is he now? He's saying that we have been blessed by the Lord. He's given us rest. He's fulfilled all of his promises, and the reason he's done that is so all the peoples of the earth may know that he is God and there's no one else. And so at this point in time, Solomon is giving credit to God for all of their prosperity and all their success and all their peace. And things are well with it. And I'll submit to you that if Solomon had not gone astray, that the history of Israel would have remained in that positive light. You know, they would have continued to follow God. God would have continued to bless them, but didn't happen that way.
So when on your timeline did he marry the Pharaoh's daughter?
What's that?
When on your timeline did he marry the Pharaoh's daughter?
I think he's married to her at this point in time,
That's what I thought.
as
So,
best we can tell.
because he built his palace and he was married to her.
Yep, yep. So I think we need to close out this lesson. We've got some time with chapter 9, at least the first 9 verses of it. Wanda, would you read that for us?
Chapter 9.
Yep, chapter 9, 1 Kings chapter 9.
So Solomon had finished building the temple of the Lord and the royal palace, and had achieved all he had desired to do. The Lord appeared to him a second time, as he had appeared to him at Gibeon. The Lord said to him, I have heard the prayer and plea you have made before me. I have consecrated this temple which you have built by putting my name there forever. My eyes and my heart will always be there. As for you, if you walk before me in integrity of heart and uprightness, as David your father did, and do all I command and observe my decrees and laws, I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised David your father, when I said you shall never fail to have a man on the throne of Israel.
Pause right there just a second. It's interesting how God speaks of David. And he says to Solomon, he says, as for you, if you will walk before me as your father David walked, in integrity of heart and uprightness, then things will go well with you.
That's the clue.
Yeah. How's that?
Because Solomon never repented. He didn't repent for marrying.
Go back to David. Did David always walk in uprightness and
No.
integrity of heart?
But he
Yeah.
repented. He confessed his
That's right.
sins and he repented.
That's right. He confessed and he repented. And he believed that God forgave and wiped away all of his sins. And that's, I think, what God is looking at here, is that David truly believed God. David poured out his heart. You read Psalm 51. He says, "Purge me with hyssop, wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow." And God says, "I did." And David afterwards, he proclaimed, I'm clean. I'm pure of heart. That's right. I'm righteous. My hands are clean. There's no blood on my hands. And why could he say that? Because God promised it, and he believed, and God counted that as integrity. That even though David had sinned, the grievous types of sin, adultery, murder, he repented, and God wiped them all away. And God declares him to be a man of integrity and uprightness of heart. And he invites Solomon to follow the way. But read on.
Okay, and that was the blessings.
Yeah.
Now it's the curses.
Mm-hmm.
But if you or your sons turn away from me and do not observe the commands and decrees I've given you, and go off to serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land I have given them, and will reject this temple I have consecrated for my name. Israel will then become a byword and an object of ridicule among all peoples. And though this temple is now imposing, all who pass by will be appalled and will scoff and say, "Why has the Lord done such a thing to this land and to this temple?" People will answer, "Because they have forsaken the Lord their God, who brought their fathers out of Egypt, and have embraced other gods, worshiping and serving them. That is why the Lord brought all this disaster on them."
My translation says in verse 8, God says, "And this house," that he's pointing to right here, that you spent in modern dollars roughly $1 trillion to build. He said, "This will become," says, "a heap of ruins." And he said that everybody who passes by will say, "Why did this happen?" They'll be astonished. And guess what? That's exactly what happened. This house turned into, it was nothing but a heap of ruins by the time the Babylonians finished with it.
But also the people they're ridiculed.
Yeah,
And today, and appalled and
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
I've lost my place.
yeah.
It falls back to where it all given a free will. Although Solomon
That's
believed God and was given all the knowledge and everything what to do, he still had a free will.
Yes, he did.
And God didn't take that away from him.
Yeah,
That's what we have today too, the free will
Yeah.
to do as we see fit.
yeah.
Sometimes we
In a
wish
couple of weeks, we're going to kill off old Solomon and bury him. But as his eulogy, we're going to read some of the things that he wrote, particularly in the book of Ecclesiastes, to find how it is that he went astray and why his life turned so terrible in the end. But we've reached a stopping point. But it's interesting as we look at this track, if you will, this chart of Israel's history, how they had their extreme high points, their extreme low points, and they just kind of bounced, up and down, around and around. I wonder if that isn't sometimes the pathway that human lives take.
I was thinking the same
Definitely.
thing.
And that's happened not just to Israel, that's happened to some countries. I wonder if that kind of thing is happening to our country today.
Also individuals.
Yeah, and individuals, particularly individuals. And you think about, when is the best time of your life? And what is it that signals the best time of your life? And then what is it that signals the worst time of your life? And sometimes I think we would do well to plot a course of our own lives and what we consider to be the best points and the worst points and where we are in our relationship to God during those times. All right, any other questions or comments before we go?